Welcome to Sideways Eye, my darkroom and studio based near Liverpool in England. I'm Tony Cairns, and just by way of introduction, I'm predominantly a film photographer with an interest in ultra-pro techniques, particularly salt printing and Bromoil. I'd consider myself an intermediate from a Bromoil point of view, but making some progress after a few years of basically not achieving very much. I've been asked to speak on what makes for a good negative for Bromoil purposes. So let me begin by looking at what other Bromoilists have said. First, let's look at David Lewis's book, The Art of Bromoil and Transfer. Incidentally, despite its small size, it has many good tips in it. On page 23, Lewis says, choose a negative suitable for the process, one on the soft side with a full range of tones. High contrast is to be avoided. And then we have Derek Watkins' book, Bromoil, A Foundation Course, which on page 37 says, it is often said by those who should know better that only soft negatives are any good for Bromoil. This is quite untrue. What is required is plenty of shadow and highlight detail. High contrast is not only a problem for Bromoil, but for any black and white printing. Finally, we come to Stephen Anshell's Darkroom Cookbook, which, again incidentally, together with his film cookbook, have been the Bibles of many darkroom workers in the past. On page 79 he says, and he's talking about the David Lewis paper, the final drawback is its one grade. That is, David Lewis paper has a grade of between 1.5 and 2. This is because the Bromoil process requires a contrasty negative, opposite to platinum and palladium. So we appear to have three different views. Lewis, who calls for the need for soft negatives, Watkins, who talks about the need for plenty of highlight and shadow detail, and Anshell, who talks about high contrast negatives being required for Bromoils. My own view is that the Anshell is wrong, and that both Lewis and Watkins are right. We can debate what a soft negative is, but the bottom line is that you want to end up with a negative that has the most information on it to give you the aesthetic options later on at the brushwork stage. I'll call this the flexible negative, one that prints easily at grade 2 without the need for lots of dodging and burning. Bromoils tend to be small prints. I have a theory that small prints attract attention through their highlights. Having piqued your curiosity through their highlights, you are physically drawn to look more closely at the print. And when you approach, you look for shadow detail. That's why when I print, I put my small prints on a wall to see how I interact with them. Take this Sanderson print. The highlights draw you in from a distance, and on getting closer you study the shadow details. So how do we produce a flexible negative? The answer is to develop the negative in the knowledge of how the film was exposed. Oversimplifying slightly, if the tonal range of a scene is greater than the film is capable of capturing, then one would pull process. That is, you'd overexpose the film to capture shadow detail, but curtail film development to prevent highlights being blown out. For a flat scene, you would do the opposite, i.e. you would push process. That is, you'd underexpose the film and overdevelop the negative. I won't describe this in more detail, as it's a normal technique for film photographers. Push and pull processing is easy enough for sheet film, but more difficult to achieve for roll film, as a roll will contain exposures that have been made under a variety of conditions. But there are techniques that help the roll film photographer. Firstly, let's look at choice of film. It makes sense to choose one that is forgiving of exposure inaccuracies and flexible in terms of developmental process. So, for example, HP5 or XP2 are very flexible, Tmax and Delta less so, both requiring greater precision in the development stage, and FP4 is inherently more contrasty than HP5. So the selection of film is a factor in getting you to a flexible negative. Second, what developer to choose? Well, there are a lot of different factors that can weigh in on developer choice. My own view is to keep it as simple and cheap as possible, remembering that for Bromoil, the aesthetic aspects are created at the brushing stage. Most of my pictures are in high contrast outdoor scenes, so I favour developers with strong compensation. What is compensation? Well, compensation is achieved when the developer is very dilute and agitation is minimal. What happens is that the silver halide in the shadow areas stop being converted due to developer exhaustion, whilst in the highlights continue to develop and put down some tonality. Compensation is achieved by the combination of dilute developers, or using two-bath developers, and the agitation method used. For example, Rodinal is normally used at a dilution of 1 to 25 or 1 to 30. At 1 to 50, it shows the Rodinal look, and used at 1 to 100 in a stand development with no agitation, it is strongly compensatory. The cost, however, of doing this is larger grain. Incidentally, the jury is out as to whether Rodinal at 1 to 50 is good for Bromoil. That Rodinal look is achieved by flattening the tonality in the midtones and contracting the tonality in the shadows and the highlights. This may work against you depending on what you're trying to achieve. Pyro developers are another option. By pyro developers, I mean developers like PMK or PyroCat HD or 510 Pyro. They produce a stain that is said to be compensatory. However, the main reason for using pyros is the high acutance, giving them the look almost like of an etching. But in Bromoil, this is achieved at the brushing stage, so pyro may be overkill. My own favoured combinations involve forgiving films in compensating developers. So I tend to use Ilford XP2 in Barry Thornton 2-bath or HP5 in D23. By the way, D23 is a metol-based developer, has no high contrast hydroquinone in it. That is to say, my technique for developing negatives for Bromoils are absolutely no different to my ordinary black and white printing. So in summary, developing for Bromoil is no different to developing for black and white printing. One is looking to capture as much shadow and highlight detail as possible. Many of today's films are quite flexible, but choosing film with good latitude helps. Also, choosing developers that exhibit compensation helps. And finally, I wouldn't get fixated on exotic film developer combinations that give certain types of look. For Bromoil, we are just trying to capture the maximum detail. The look is obtained at the brushing stage. So thanks very much for listening.
Um, so yeah, that was a kind of a great start into the developing aspect of the film. Would love to hear any thoughts or feedback, because I'm sure there are plenty of opinions out there around the development of the film, and this is an area that I personally have not done very much experimenting with for fear of screwing up my film. So I'll be finally diving off into trying some Rodinal, hopefully this weekend, with some of my shots and see what that's like. But yeah, any thoughts or feedback on Tony's presentation?
Think he's obviously done a lot of work Austin, in the research side. But I tend to just keep it simple and use Perceptol with my Ilford films. Obviously, it matters. The subject matter and material is what makes the development process change. According to lighting conditions, and if I took the same scene in bright sunlight or in darker lighting, then you would have, even if I used the same developer, then I would obviously have to change the timings and exposures. So very interesting.
I mean, I think Perceptol is a great developer. I know Baron Thornton was very, very keen on Perceptol, and it's very similar to D23. The only
Right.
slight problem with Perceptol is that it reduces film speed a bit. So it
Yeah.
depends on, it's better for certain conditions than other conditions because
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
reduces speed. Yeah.
Do you do you tend to use one shot, Tony, or
No,
do you,
I tend to use D23 and replenish it.
yeah,
So I make up my own D23, which is a mixture of just metol and sodium sulfite. I think it's 7.5 grams of metol, 100 grams of sodium sulfite in a liter of distilled water. And then I also make up a redeveloper, which has some sodium metaborate in it. So that as I start to use up my D23, I replenish it with my replenisher.
yeah.
Um, and it basically lasts forever.
In the
Richard, I do strictly one shot developing
Yeah,
myself.
yeah,
I do PMK, and I have for
yes.
many, many years. And I do one sheet of film at a time in trays. I don't use
Right.
tanks or anything like that or racks. So it takes a long time to develop film, obviously, when I've got 20 or 30 sheets to do. But I wanted a process that was, I didn't have to vary
Yeah,
from one film to another. It was the same way every single time. I didn't have to think about things. I would just wanted to keep it as simple as possible.
yeah,
So
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for that approach. I think that's why Barry Thornton 2 bath also works well, because it's very forgiving of temperature. It doesn't matter what the temperature is. It's always going to be 4.5 minutes in bath A, 4.5 minutes in bath B, and it's done. It doesn't matter what film you're using. So it's quite an easy way of developing, I think.
for me, developing sheet film is boring enough as it is in total
Yeah.
darkness. So I don't want something that I have to think about every single time I try developing something different. So
Sure.
uh, Kirk, if you're still with us, would love to hear any thoughts or words of wisdom, and as far as your developing process, since you seem to nail it every single time. He might be doing something else right now.
Yeah, it might be.
Um, yeah, David, any thoughts, comments, contributions?
Well, I'm just kind of absorbing all of this because, I'm sort of a jack of all trades, master of few, if it or none. So my bromoils have been pretty much, failures. So I'm just trying to figure out what I need to do to get that along the way. Yeah, I mean, I probably 50-50 use negatives and 50-50 use digital negatives. I think all the bromoils I've tried have been digital negatives. So I'm kind of incorporating this into what I should try to get as far as detail and tonality out of those for silver.
Nice. Dave, any thoughts, or what, want to share any of your process with us?
I stopped shooting film quite a number of years ago. Now I shoot totally digitally and work with digital negatives.
Oh, that's right. You've gone completely to digital now, huh?
Yeah, I mean, even if I pull some old film stuff out of the archive that I want, I will digitize it and make a digital neg. That way, I feel you save a lot of paper. I used to have binfuls of paper when I had negatives, film negatives, and I would find so much wastage. But with digital negative, you've done all your dodging, burning, everything in computer, even down to pixel level, and it's basically as perfect as you can get it. So you lose very little paper that way. I lose more paper inking than I do with the actual prints.
Gotcha. Megan, I saw that you just joined as well. I'm not sure. Have you had a chance to do Bromoil? I think most of the stuff I've seen from you has been photopolymer gravure.
Yeah, no, thanks. I've been dancing around the idea of Bromoil for years. But I was actually really happy Tony, thanks for that video. On my side, just a couple of years ago, I moved from 35 millimeter to shooting 4x5, and I'm still wrapping my head around I think, possibilities of what I can do with how I develop film in sheet film versus roll film. So that was really helpful for me to think about how I could use what I'm shooting in Bromoil, but I haven't had a chance to try yet. So I'm still in my research phase. So these videos are really helpful. Thank you everyone for the knowledge sharing.
Cool. Awesome. Anybody have experience doing stand development? It's not something I've had the nerve to jump off into yet. But it seems like it would be ideal for Bromoil. Because from what I understand, creates a lower contrast negative.
I've done a fair amount with Rodinal, 1:100,
Mm-hmm.
a little bit with 510 Pyro at 1:200. With Rodinal, you have to be careful of bromide drag, it's called.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're not careful, you can get streaks because of the lack of agitation.
Lack of agitation. So
yeah, streaks.
So with stand, yeah, I assume with stand you just leave it there, but there is still a little bit of agitation that has to happen at certain points.
Well, with pure stand development, you agitate it at the beginning,
mm-hmm.
and you just leave it for an hour, say. It's sometimes preferable to do semi-stand, where you pick it up at halfway point, and just give it a few swirls.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, there's a risk of having these bromide drags on the film. Yeah,
I've used stand Rodinal as well, mostly to save shots that I took on the completely wrong exposure or whatever, just to get something that is actually usable. But one thing that has actually worked nice with 400 ISO films is Caffeinol CL.
Mm.
I've had some really nice results with that.
Yeah, it's very cheap too.
Yep.
What did you like about the Caffeinol CL?
I don't know. It just there were lots of details in the entire range, but also it just especially with medium large format film, the image just seemed to pop nicely for me. I'm not a real technical whiz on these things, so I just kind of go by what I see and gut instinct and try to standardize as best as I can. So
nice. Cool. Well, yeah. Any questions for Tony while we've got him on the call here? Since it seems like he definitely does a lot of experimentation. All right. Well, yeah, Tony, the one question I had with the Barry Thornton 2-bath, that's something you make up yourself?
Yeah, you from memory, you get, I think it's 6.5 grams of metal and 100 grams, no, 75 grams of sodium sulfite in a litre of water, and that would be bath A.
Mm-hmm.
And in bath B, you've got sodium metaborate, which is the activator.
Okay.
So you put your film in bath A, which is all you're doing is you're soaking the emulsion in the primary developer, which in this case is metal. It's a soft developer, a bit like D23, which was Ansel Adams' favorite developer. And then once you've soaked the acetate with the emulsion on it in the metal, you take it out and you put it into bath B. And bath B is the sodium metaborate, an alkali, which is the activator. And you just keep it 4.5 minutes. And it's always 4 to 4.5 minutes for both bath A and bath B. And it works from a wide range of temperatures, from about 15 C all the way up to about 25, 26 C. So you don't have to be spot on with your temperatures.
Nice.
So it's quite a good technique. And it's also, so the highlights are sometimes are often preserved.
Yeah, most of the time I used to use Rodinal developer, or later as it was known.
Yeah, is that Kirk?
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah, it was Kirk.
Yeah.
Let's see. Is he still here? There he is. Yeah, Kirk, what were you saying about Rodinal?
He must be having problems with his kit, I think.
Well, cool. And then last question I had, Tony, you mentioned some element that increases the contrast.
Hydroquinone.
Yeah.
So hydroquinone is strongly superadditive with metal in NQ type developers. So if you take D23, that's just metal plus sodium sulfite, which is a preservative. You take D76, which is probably the world's most popular developer. It has hydroquinone in it as well, which is super additive with metal. And D76 is a super developer. It's a lovely developer. The only problem is that it crushes the highlight slightly because the hydroquinone is high contrast.
Gotcha. So yeah, I'd be interested to look into, because I've been just using Ilford Ilfosol 3. Because that's what I had easy access to. But I would be interested to see what the chemical composition is of that, because I'm guessing that it's probably bumping the contrast, since that's a more popular look within just straight black and white.
Yeah, I mean, it was the photojournalist's favorite developer, I think, wasn't it? Because it's very, very, very easy. It keeps a long time, easy to use.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, cool, man. We're gonna go ahead and wrap up because we're right at the hour here, and want to make sure everybody has a chance to get out and capture some shots this weekend or get into the dark room.